like really concerned. I'm getting over it. Damn it, I just fell down. That's it. I'm getting back up. No. Good to see you.
Time to get started?
Pretty soon.
Okay.
You want to give it a couple minutes?
I'm on your time.
We're good? Hi, thank you everyone for coming today. I feel like you might know who this guy is that's going to speak to us, but I'd like to introduce him anyway. This is Dr. Curt Rom from the University of Arkansas. He's a horticulture professor. He is a lifelong resident of the Ozarks with a deep passion for local culture, food, and community. He focuses on sustainable and organic food production systems, emphasizing small-scale farming practices. So let's welcome Dr.
That's good enough.
Curt Rom.
Good.
Let's fire this thing up and see how it goes.
Here. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. It's actually wonderful. As a college professor, the first thing you have to do is take attendance. There's no attendance. And then I have to worry about whether you're learning, and you have to worry about whether I know what I'm talking about. But there's no exams. I hope that what I tell you you'll find interesting, because it's a personal story for me. As I like to call it, it's my personal romance of the apple. So we'll kind of dig in. October is National Apple Month. And so we're celebrating the apple right now. It's the time we harvest. And there's two times a year that we might think about apples. It's two periods of real glory of the apple. First is the time of bloom in the spring, and then harvest in the fall. And we're in that period of time where farmers have worked and worried all season long to get an apple to be harvested so that you can enjoy that. I'd like to start today with a little poem to kind of set the mood. And it's a poem by Robert Frost, and it's called After Apple Picking Time. My long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill. Beside it there's 2 or 3 or more apples I didn't pick upon some bough. But right now I'm done with apple picking now. The essence of winter's sleep is on the night. The scent of apples I'm drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass. I skimmed the morning from the drinking trough as I held it to the world of hoary grass. It melted. I let it fall and break, but I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell from forming my dream was about to take. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch now aches. It keeps the pressure upon the ladder round. I feel that ladder sway as the boughs bend. I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of a load upon load of apples coming in. For I have too much now of apple picking. I'm overtired of the great harvest I myself once desired. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in my hand, lift down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap, as if of no worth. One can see what will trouble the sleep of mine, whatever sleep there is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, as I desire it's coming on now, some human sleep. It's after apple picking time. Thank you, Robert Frost. As we think about apples and what it takes to bring apples to the story. So I'm hopefully going to tell a story from my perspective, share some thoughts, some ideas, in the way I understand the history and science of apples. Apples, the story of apples in the Ozarks is a personal story for me because I grew up on an apple orchard, the Rom family orchard. Just located northeast of Fayetteville, a small family orchard began operation in 1965 and continued until my father, at the age of 91 in 2010, decided he was too busy. And I knew I was too busy to continue. But that's where I grew up. My father was also a pomologist and a horticultural scientist at the University of Arkansas. And as they say, a rotten apple never falls too far from the tree. So out of his 4 children, I was the one that fell in love with that tree and dedicated my career to horticulture. But our family orchard provided not only a means for me to go to college, but provided an opportunity for my 2 daughters, shown in this picture, at the Fayetteville Farmers Market, to work at the family orchard as the 3rd generation and to spend time with their grandfather, and also for my daughters Zoe and Cleo to become part of the Ozark apple story. But my story was not just in the orchard, it was in the laboratory where I was able to train young students and work with them and study with them, and as I have done for the last 43 years. But probably one of my favorite pictures is this picture on your right that shows my father and I, outstanding professionals in our field. So where does the apple story really start? And it's a long story, so I'm going to try in the next 50 minutes or so go 1,000 years or 500 years or 100 years or 50 or 20 or 10 years of the apple story for the Ozarks. We know apples are important in our Western mythology. There's the goddess Pomona, who is the goddess of the orchards, of the fruits. And she guarded those fruits, and we know that that was important and part of our mythology. But we also know in a lot of our Western religious mythology that maybe there was a fruit tree in the center of the Garden of Eden that we consider to be the tree of truth and knowledge. Actually, it wasn't until about the 15th century that apple trees were first portrayed in the Garden of Eden. And that's the picture I show on the right here. The first time that an apple tree, which actually was shown as a tree of, considered to be a tree of wealth in Europe at that time, is shown as the tree in the center of the Garden of Eden. So we think often of fruits as being that source of original sin. But it also not only is a source of sin and mortality, but in a lot of mythologies, it's the symbol of immortality. So we go from fruits of sin to fruits of apples of immortality. The Swedish goddess Frida, who said that if you would eat her apples, you would be granted immortality. We know that apples are symbolic in other ways. They're the symbol of love and fertility. And from the book of the Song of Solomon, we know that apples are unique in the forest. And refresh me with apples, for I am sick of love. Nothing will cure heartbreak better than a fresh apple. But we know that you can bob for apples for love. And it would be a common custom for young ladies to find who would they date for that night by bobbing for apples and seeing what initialed apples they would come up with. Or we know that you could throw an apple peel over your shoulder and it would spell out the love of your life. We know that giving an apple to your teacher would ensure at least some form of favor and at least compensate them for tolerating you in the classroom. But we know that apples are also an iconic symbol of health as well as education because, you know, an apple a day. But apples have other kinds of meanings. You might think of poisonous apples. Again, that apple of original sin, a poisoned apple. Or this for Pomona. Pomona was tempted by the god of the deciduous temperate forests, Vertimaeus, who dressed up as a woman and poisoned an apple and offered it to Pomona with the idea that if Pomona would take a bite of the apple, she would fall in love with Vertimaeus. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and Vertimaeus in disgust threw off his clothes and revealed that he was really a man. But in the intervening time, apple trees became deciduous trees. But there's other times that we think in our own Western stories about poison apples. Do you recognize this story of a witch with a poison apple? What is that story? Snow White, of course, eats an apple and falls asleep until awakened by her own prince. And we even brought it into American cultural mythology with the character Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed actually is a very interesting story. He ran away from home as a very young teenager from an abusive household, and he joined the Western expansion, taking the opportunity that if you would go out into the Western expansion of Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, you could claim farmland by planting apple seeds, planting apple trees. And he became one of the largest landowners. But that particular story resonated with us, the pioneer spirit, and it was maybe best exemplified by Walt Disney. He's been good to me too. Apples have given me my life. Apples are part of my story, and I'm part of the apple story of Northwest Arkansas. We do know that apples for a long time have been considered important for our health. As this Gaelic and Celtic saying says, "Ate an apple for going to bed, and you'll make the doctor beg his bread." That was later translated to American language in 1905 at the St. Louis Exposition. And that's a story I'll get to in a minute. So how did apples get from where they originated scientifically to where they are today, particularly to the Ozarks? The story of apples began in China, where there were 2 or 3 species of wild crab apples, very small, probably no bigger than your thumbnail. And they were then consumed by megafauna such as bears or large birds. And in the digestion process, they were stratified and scarified, and then they moved along the northern edge of the Himalayan mountains. And then there was a recycling of this. And as these animals brought these species of apples together, they interhybridized with each other. And they created the apple that we know as the primary progenitor of apples, which is Malus sieversii. Malus sieversii is the parent of the apple that we eat. The apple that we eat, Malus domestica, doesn't exist in the wild. It's actually an artifact of humankind. But this is the closest parent. This is a box of apples gathered from the forests of Kazakhstan, where it's a climax forest, and the major species of trees in that forest, topography very much like the Ozarks, would be apple trees and pear trees. And so, in knowing that they're being cut down for expansion and commerce and use of fuel, the United States Germplasm Repository has been going the last 30 years to Kazakhstan to collect those. And so now the world's largest collection of apple germplasm is in Cornell, New York. But that's what wild apples look like in the woods. And you can almost see apples that you eat at the grocery store from that. So from Kazakhstan, then humans got involved. And early in our civilization, in the Stone Age and Neolithic period, we started eating them ourselves. And as we were migrating, we moved them. And as we moved them, they started to evolve and adapt to the ecosystem. So we see them moving into Turkey and the central part of the Fertile Crescent. We see them moving into Southern Europe, being moved by humans as a food source for that. And then as they evolved to those ecotypes, new species were evolved. And then as we continued to migrate and civilizations formed, we brought those species back together. They interhybridized naturally among themselves, and they gave us the apple that we know today. Now, apples are in the rose family, and maybe you've seen that. If you look at an apple blossom, it looks like a rose blossom. And there are a rose species. There's 50 to 60 different Malus species that are related to apple. We call most of them crab apples. There are only a few of them that are large, and there's only a few of them that are edible. None of them are poisonous. Some are just inedible. They won't kill you, but they'll make you pretty stomach sick. when you try to eat those. But we've been eating apples for a long time, so there's evidence going back to the Neolithic period, approximately 11 to 12,000 BCE, so 13,000 years ago. There's botanical evidence that we've been consuming apples. It's been part of our human diet for a long time. And actually, we've been culturing them for somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years. In my view as a horticulturist, they are among the most spoiled of all plant crops. They can't really exist in the wild, not the apple that we know, because we've been culturing them for 5,000 to 7,000 years. We've been taking care of them, we've been watering them, we've been fertilizing them, we've been keeping insects away from them, we've been keeping animals away from them so that we could enjoy them. This is truly the spoiled child of the food system. But it's become very important. It's one of our older cultivated fruits. The fruit in the bottom right-hand side is Inerca. That's the oldest known continuously existing apple. It originated in Italy somewhere between the 1st and the 5th century of the Common Era. So we're looking at an apple that's approximately 1,500 to 1,700 years old that has been in continuous cultivation since then. In North America, we have our own native apple species, or crabapple species. There are 3 that are native to the eastern United States, and 1 is native to the western United States. 2 of them, Angustifolia and Malus ioensis, are both native here to the Ozark region. And there's evidence that they were consumed by indigenous peoples that inhabited this area. As they were migrating, and at this time of year, as they were starting to be mature, they would be harvested, eaten in a range of ways, often dried, often cooked, often added to as a spice or an herb in other cooking of the indigenous peoples. But we have our own native apple that we can still claim to. But how did apples then make the journey from the Mediterranean region and Europe to the United States? As the pilgrims and the immigrants were coming to the United States or to the Americas from Europe, they needed a source of nutrition, particularly a source of vitamin C. And the best and most reliable source of vitamin C were apples and apple products, and particularly apple cider. At a time that water was contaminated and you couldn't drink water, you could drink fermented cider because the alcohol inside of the cider would sterilize the liquid. So in many regards, apple cider was healthier for you to drink than was water, because not only did you have a pure liquid source, but you also had vitamin C. And so it was real important. So the early immigrants brought apples with them, and more importantly, apple seedlings, because apple trees are difficult to transport. And so you would bring seedlings. And so a lot of the apples that we have in our country originated in our country because they came over as seeds from Europe. Apples were really important in colonial times. Again, almost every yard would have an apple tree for the purpose of having apple cider, apple vinegar, and we only used apple vinegar until white vinegar came around about the beginning of the early parts of the 20th century. When we said vinegar, we meant apple vinegar. That was the vinegar of choice. So we used it as a drink. We used it as a preservative. We used it as an antiseptic. And so apples were grown in every colonial household, and it became an early farming system in colonial United States. And then as we saw the Western migration across our great country, we would see first those on foot that are moving into the Western Reserve, such as Johnny Appleseed, or those that moved down, and particularly important to us in Arkansas, those that moved into Tennessee, to the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, because then they moved westward in a trail that was essentially paved for them by the Cherokee Trail of Tears. And they migrated, and that's who made residence in northwest Arkansas. But we also then saw the apple culture move down the rivers of the Ohio River into the Mississippi River, up the Arkansas River, up through the White River, and into the Ozark region. And we started to see proliferation of orchards. And then the trains became very important to us, and trains would start to move apples westward. And just as apples helped promote Arkansas as the best place to grow apples, at one point in time, the trains left northwest Arkansas because they had clear-cut the hills. We were starting to have crop failure in the Ozarks, and so our train system left and our transportation system left, and the train system moved out to the West Coast, particularly Washington State, where just as they were successful at selling land in the Ozarks for apples, they could sell land in Washington State. As a result of this, every state, you typically moved apple seeds. And so as these pioneers and these immigrants into our states would plant their new farms, every state has their own apples that they claim to fame. And we're going to talk a little bit about Arkansas apples later in this. But Arkansas became the place. This is where apples could grow big. The land here was being clear-cut for lumber to move to the Great Plains, to Kansas City and St. Louis. Farmland was becoming cleared. And actually, we'd already kind of, in the first generation of agriculture in northwest Arkansas, worn out the land from tobacco and cotton production. And we needed something that was allegedly could grow on poor ground. And that was the apple tree. Now, that's not true. But again, because of the lumber industry and the railroads moving in, they would clear land, they would buy land, and they'd want to sell land as ideal for apple orchards. Probably the first apple orchard in the state of Arkansas was located down in Little Rock. The first apple orchard in northwest Arkansas likely located out at Cane Hill, and a tremendous opportunity there. And some apples here in Fayetteville. The apples that we grew here were all immigrants like the people. None of them really originated that made success here. So the apples of success for us were apples like Jonathan, Rome Beauty, Winesap, Stamen, Ben Davis. We all consider those now heritage or legacy or antique apples. The only apple really left in commerce is Jonathan. Still the apple we recommend as the best apple to grow in Arkansas, as it was recommended over 125 years ago. Apple production in Arkansas occurred in several locations. It took advantage of our topography, the Boston Plateau, the Ouachita Mountains, the edge of the Ozarks on the eastern side, and Crowley's Ridge. So we saw apple industry spring up along high ground that gave us cooler environments and better air drainage, prevented frosts. The greatest consolidation of that was here in northwest Arkansas. And it became big business for us. And we promoted it as big business. So if we look at a map of Arkansas at the time, oh, my pointer here, laser doesn't work. This is a map of the railroads. The first railroad to come into northwest Arkansas came down into Rogers, and then it came down into Fayetteville. And from Fayetteville, then we built spurs out to Prairie Grove, to Lincoln, to Cane Hill. We built spurs to Sonora and all the way out into Madison County, into Carroll County. All of those came back either into Rogers or into Fayetteville. And as a result, the railroads wanted to haul multiple products. They were hauling lumber products, they were hauling minerals, but they also could haul high-value crop like apples during apple season. So the railroads are an important part of our story. They promoted apple production in the Ozarks more than anybody else. It wasn't a statewide initiative or a county or a community initiative. It was a railroad initiative and railroad real estate that built our apple industry. And we were quite proud of it. We demonstrated apples at state fairs, at regional fairs, at community organizations. And so here are some examples of that. At the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in 1893, we had 1,500 entries, more than any other state in the United States. We won more prizes than any other state. Apples from Washington County were considered the best in the United States. And we even sent W.G. Vincenheller, who was the director of the experiment station from the University of Arkansas, to go up and see this, see for himself that apples of Northwest Arkansas were the best in the world. Vincenheller worked at the university, rode a horse in, lived in Springdale, and actually was one of the founding presidents of the Arkansas Horticulture Society and became an orchardist himself. In the next World's Fair, the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, the Secretary of Agriculture of the state of Missouri is J.T. Stinson. J.T. Stinson was one of my forefathers. He was a professor of horticulture and worked at the experiment station at the University of Arkansas as one of the first founding pomologists before going to Missouri as the Secretary of Agriculture. And he is credited with the mythology that he took that old Gaelic saying and promoted the apple exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair, that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And that's where it originated. At that, we demonstrated 375 varieties, over 200 local varieties that were developed from Northwest Arkansas. And that's kind of our heritage that we had there. And again, Vincenheller went to go see that particular exhibit. And it was stated, there is no question that northern Arkansas and the Ozarks comprise the territory that will be known as the fruit belt of the world. And indeed we were. Stark Brothers Nursery, the largest nursery in the United States, said, there is no better place for fruit culture. And they had a nursery just outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas. Apples in the settlement of Northwest Arkansas were very unique. Again, we have to think about the migrant pioneers that were moving into the Ozarks, and they didn't have grocery stores, and so they brought things they could grow to satisfy their need. So it was very important for personal use. Apples were a multi-use crop. You can make vinegar out of it for all the preservative and antiseptic uses, and also for vitamin C. You could drink cider as a clean liquid source. You could dry them, you could cook them, you could keep them for months to where we would have fruit in the winter in your root cellar. So very important to the settlers for personal use. But as they started getting success, then it became a growing business in Northwest Arkansas. And we commercialized those exact same things. We commercialized drying and canning. We commercialized the production of cider and brandy, although most of the apples that we produced here were shipped elsewhere for fermentation and processing. We created a vinegar process, and at one time the largest vinegar plant in the world was allegedly in Northwest Arkansas, in Rogers, Arkansas. If you had been around 25 years ago and you drove to Rogers, about where Heritage High School is now, you would have smelled vinegar. It was the smell of the town of Rogers. You knew you were there. It was delightful. And we knew we could ship apples all across the United States, particularly shipping to Kansas City and St. Louis, which were major transportation hubs, and they could be distributed elsewhere through the United States. Where did we grow apples in Northwest Arkansas? Well, here's a topographic map, and just to orient you, there's Fayetteville in the center, Springdale, Rogers, and Bentonville, Prairie Grove, Lincoln, and Cane Hill out here. So the green areas, if you look at a topographic map, the dark green are forested and typically mountainous areas. The whiter areas would be pasture cleared and flatter areas. And so these flatter areas are where we tended to grow apples. So in Washington County, there's this big V that extends out to Lincoln, Prairie Grove, and Cane Hill. And that was full of apples. Just northeast of Fayetteville, kind of out towards Goshen, Goshen towards Sonora, and then extending up to Bethel Heights, Lowell. And if you drive the new Dickey-Trammell Highway, which opened up about 5 years ago, look at the street names. They're all named after fruit, because that was a corridor for fruit production. That wasn't a highway at the time. Highway 71 was, and so even in my lifetime, both sides of Highway 71 were lined with apples. Rogers was kind of in the center of that. It extended over southwest of Bentonville into the west of Rogers, all the way extending all the way over into Gentry. If we think about the heyday of population of Fayetteville, we had 4,500. The other towns were just over 1,000. So we were the center of business and commerce for this. So although production might have been outside of our county and outside of our community, you know, Fayetteville's, you've driven northwest Arkansas. We're the hilly town. Everybody else is the flat town. We have curvy streets, and they all have straight streets. So we didn't grow apples really in Fayetteville, but we were the source of economy and also the source of academics and knowledge for growing apples. This picture was even in the advertisement. This is Mr. Kantz. And if you drive out Mission Boulevard right now, the intersection of Mission Boulevard and 265, you'll see Kantz Shopping Center. And that land was owned by the Kantz family and the Skillern family, which he married into. Rom Family Orchard was part of the old Skillern farm, a former apple farm in the turn of the century till about the 1940s, and then we rehabilitated the land to plant an orchard in the 1960s for that. At those times, 1900 and 1910, it was estimated that Benton County had more than 2 million apple trees, which by estimates would be 40,000 acres. In Washington County, we had approximately 1.5 million apple trees. 30,000 acres, together 70,000 acres. And so that's an immense size. There's no state other than Washington State now that has more apple trees than that. So we were the center of all of that. It was the largest concentration of apples produced in the United States. And here's a picture, and it even says, apples as far as the eye could see. So this is the hill about where the water towers in northeast Springdale are, looking west. And just look at that. Orchards everywhere you look. And that's what we were like at the time. You knew orchards were big and they were doing well. This orchardist has 12 teams of matched mules. Could you imagine owning 12 matched teams of mules? The incredible wealth that would have been needed for that. Here is a line of wagons coming in from harvest to the Springdale railhead. And on the back of this picture it said it took 6 to 8 hours in line to make it the miles in to unload my apples. Apple picking became a great source of labor and wealth for northwest Arkansas. It was our business before chickens and retail were our business. It was the business in northwest Arkansas. You can see the rail lines here at Shiloh or Springdale, Arkansas, loading apples into refrigerated cars. And there's the railhead at Gentry. Before the town of Gentry was named Gentry, it used to be called Orchard, Arkansas. So you can tell the importance of the fruit industry. We sold fruit many ways. Actually, 100 years ago, we didn't eat many apples. We ate less apples than we eat now, but we drank a whole lot more. So we drank hard cider, was the drink of choice in the United States prior to Prohibition. Probably one of the other drinks of choice would have been apple brandy. Again, it was a safe source of liquid, but it was also our source of entertainment. Vinegar was used as our major preservative. And so apples were used for those liquid sources, but we also dried apples. Apples that could not make grade for processing or were too small or misshapen or soft or off-colored would have been used for dried apple production. And so we would dry those apples, and at one point in time we had more than 250 apple dryers in Washington and Benton County. It was one of our major industries that we had. Storage of apples became real important too, because we had to harvest them, get them stored till the trains could move them off. And it might take several months for that supply chain to move all of the fruit out. And so some farmers had small root cellars and storage houses. Larger storage houses were built communally. And then even in locations like Fayetteville, we built storage houses. Again, dried apples were important. Dried apples, to dry apples, you have to peel them because you weren't allowed to sell dried apples with peeling on them. And those peelings became a secondary industry for us and became the beginning of our vinegar industry that we have. But let's focus in on Fayetteville. Again, the center of commerce, the largest population center, and also the center of intellect. And part of the reason for this entire lecture today is because the city has taken one of the last remaining landmarks of our apple industry down on West Street and Spring Street, and has remodeled it and is reopening it as an art space and an event space. And that is the Porter Warehouse. And you can see Porter Warehouse right there. So let me orient you to this map. So there is West Street, right up here where you see the Frisco Hotel. And I'm going to enlarge this in a minute. The Frisco Hotel, that's the Walton Arts Center. Where we see the pink buildings and the yellow buildings, that's the Ramble. Let's zoom in on that a little bit closer so we can actually see what's happening there. So the Porter Warehouse, you can see in a map of 1901, city map of Fayetteville, is known as the Apple Warehouse. If we look out here, the kinds of businesses that supported the apple industry, Arkansas Cold Storage and Ice. So we were one of the first locations in Arkansas to use compressed ammonia to manufacture ice. The manufacture of ice meant that we could store apples here for months to store that, send them out. And so warehouses like the Arkansas Cold Storage would do that. We had a wholesale food supplier that focused on Northwest Arkansas produce, the wholesale grocer, located right at the corner of Dixon Street and West Street. Again, right where the corner of the Ramble is right now. And they specialized in selling produce. If we look here to the lumber company, this was a wagon company, but they also manufactured staves for barrels. And so we can look over here and we can see the barrel warehouse headquarters and the barrel manufacturing center. This was the wood processing center. This was their stock. This is where they stored their oak stock. But all of this would make the wagons in the barrels that moved the Arkansas apple industry. And so we've rebuilt that back into Fayetteville, and we're saving that one piece of heritage. Maybe before the Ramble, you would have seen the stairwell going down right there where those stairs to the underground storage rooms of the Arkansas Ice House. We used to have a stairwell. You could see the stairwell went down into a fish pond where they kept koi and the rock archway. I apologize, I still don't have a picture of that. Vinegar became real important. Again, this was our major preservative. If you said vinegar 100 years ago, you meant cider vinegar, because white vinegar was not a common process. And this was kind of the third use of apples. First use would have been fresh apples, although we didn't eat many. Primary use would have been making cider. And when I say cider, I mean hard cider. The third use of apples would have been drying. The fourth use of apples you didn't use for anything else, you made vinegar with. And so that was our process. And so we had vinegar plants all over. Vinegar plants, in this case, in both Springdale and out in Prairie Grove. The university became real important because we became the source of knowledge for modern fruit farming. And then also the city of Springdale. This is the Springdale Meeting House, or the Grange that's on the Shiloh Museum property. That became the headquarters of the Arkansas Horticulture Society, where our fruit growers would meet very frequently to share information, and where professors like me would go give lectures to the growers. The halcyon days, the greatest days, 1890 to probably about 1940 or so, we sold a lot of apples. In Washington County, because of our commerce and the fact we shipped so many out of Washington County. When I say Washington County, I really mean Fayetteville. We shipped more apples out than any other location in the world. We became real important. It was our major export, and we had a whole range of ancillary industries. We had nurseries, we had supply companies, we had livery stables, we had horseshoers, all of those things that you need to support the agriculture industries blossomed in Northwest Arkansas. And it became so important to us, as you know, the apple blossom is the Arkansas state blossom. And I hope we never change that, because that is our heritage. It's the apples that built our Northwest Arkansas economy. and it's the apple that built the Arkansas economy in many regards. The apples that we grew here were mostly seedlings. They were brought in, and we did really well with that. After a grower would identify a good apple, he would start to propagate it and sell it. And it became a second form of income for an apple farmer, to promote his own apples, to sell them to a nursery or to sell them to his fellow apple growers. So we'd see that going on. The apples of commerce, which really made our industry, were Ben Davis. It was the king of apples. It was the one that really made us. It was rock hard. It was dark colored. It didn't show bruises. You could pack it into those wooden barrels, clamp on the lid, roll them onto a train, take them up to St. Louis and unpack them, and they looked pretty good. They were very rich in flavors. They processed really well. They made fantastic cider, made fantastic dried apples as well. But also wine sap, black twig, mammoth. Mammoth black twig is an Arkansas apple. Shannon was found and named out at Cane Hill. A lot of apples were named in northwest Arkansas. This is a list of those that are now extinct. These don't exist. There are still apple collectors going out to see if we can find these, and it's a little hard to say. We occasionally, somebody will say, I found this apple, or it was on my parents' farm. We don't have any way to test it now. We don't have a genetic background. We can go back and see if it's the apple that really exists. We do still have some apples that are existing. Arkansas Black, that actually by the university and by the USDA said was not a good apple for commerce and recommended apple growers against planting, is now probably the most popular Arkansas apple that there is. And it's probably most popular because it says Arkansas in it. But it was regarded as being an apple of low quality. In fact, there's the legend that says the way to create an edible Arkansas Black is after you harvest it, you pack it in a bushel basket. You should dig a hole in the ground that's 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and you line it with composted horse manure. You close it up, you dig it open in January, you throw away the apples and you eat the horse manure. That's what people thought about that apple. Now, I'm not recommending that as a cultural practice, don't get me wrong. All of these apples were chance seedlings. Farmers found them and profited from growing them. We did have an apple breeding program at one time, and we're trying to wrap it up. We have released 3 apples that are in commerce, small commerce, and that's Arc Charm, Monarch, and Stellar. And so we did have some. But then things changed. As happens, things change, and we got into decline. What happened? What happened to the Arkansas apple industry? You don't see 70,000 acres today. Well, this is a classic story of bad agriculture. Large monocultures mean that we wore out the land. We overfarmed it. We had an explosion of new diseases and insect pests. When we brought apples here, since apples were not native, there were no insect or disease pests. But the insects and disease found their way here. And so we had a range of those. We had the passing of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. And apples from Arkansas took on a bad reputation. A shipment of apples was rejected at a port in Boston. England put a ban on buying Arkansas apples because they had too much pesticide on them. And they had too much pesticide because we had to control these new pests. And quite honestly, we were now overproducing relative to our regional markets. And there were new industries coming on in Illinois, Ohio, in other areas, in particular in Washington State. We lost our markets and our transportation. Here are the diseases that were brought in. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that will actually kill a tree in about 2 years. And it came from Europe. Bitter rot came from Europe. Apple scab came from Europe. So these were also migrant diseases brought in on other fruit that farmers would bring in, or horticultural pioneers would bring in, or travelers would bring in. They brought in these diseases. They followed then the transportation pathways that we had, and next thing you know, they started to kill our orchards and infect our fruit. We didn't have those. Some very important insect pests. Codling moth came from Europe. Codling moth is the worm in the apple. And as they say, there's only one thing worse than a worm in an apple, and it is a half of a worm in an apple. That's right. That's the codling moth. It lays its eggs in the end, the flower, the blossom end of the apple early in the season. The eggs hatch, the caterpillar moves in and eats the inside of the apple, comes out, drops to the ground in its chrysalis, and then releases itself as moth. We had San Jose scale. It was called San Jose scale because actually it was diagnosed by the USDA in San Jose, California. However, it came from Asia and moved in quite quickly. We had a range of apple borers come in, both from the east and west outside of the United States. And these apple borers would bore into the trunk of trees and kill trees. And so to counteract that, we had to spray. And we didn't have good spray technology. The most important spray that we used was lead arsenate. And if you want to think about two things we really don't want in our food system, they'd be lead and arsenic. But this is the only tool that we had. And the insects and disease started developing resistance to this. So the first year we might only have to apply 500 pounds per acre to control. The next year it might be 700 pounds. Then it's 1,000 pounds. Then it's 2,000 pounds. The next thing you know, we've contaminated our soil with lead and arsenic, and we've made our soils to where you couldn't grow apple trees on them. We did it to ourselves. It just is the technology we had. And weather became a real problem for us. I'm an ecophysiologist. I study how the weather affects horticultural crops. We lost our transportation system. As apple industries started to blossom in Washington State, and as we lost our forest, there was no reason for the railroad to be here. So the railroads pulled up and left. At one time, we only had one rail line coming into northwest Arkansas, and we had a gravel road that went to Fort Smith and a gravel road that went to Joplin. We had no way to move all of these apples from 3 million trees. And so we lost our markets, we lost our transportation system. We developed that bad reputation. Time changed. We changed tastes. There's another fictitious story, and I really wish it was true, that Mr. Stark of Stark Nurseries came to an Arkansas horticulture meeting, fruit growers meeting, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a new apple. And this new apple is called the Star Crimson Delicious. I also call it the Red Delicious Apple." And he goes, "Believe me, people are going to stop drinking and they're going to start eating apples. We need to go from tart apples to sweet apples." And the story is he was picked up and thrown in the mud in the streets in Springdale. How dare you tell us that we should not grow tart, hard Ben Davis, and we should grow a soft, crisp, sweet apple that you only sell. But that was the delicious apple, which in the world today is the #1 apple. And it was the #1 apple in the United States for more than 75 years. So then there was competition from Washington State. The Depression set in, the Dust Bowl. We had wars in World War I and World War II. And as you know, our wars are fought on the backs of farm boys because they could go get a good pair of shoes, 2 pairs of pants, 3 square meals a day. And that might be a better future than you could find on the farm. And so we know that that's what happened. Let's look at the weather for those of us that are weather nerds like me. So this is weather data for central and United States over the period of the last 120 years. The gray dotted line in the middle is the average, the 120-year average temperature. So the yellow line are the average annual temperatures. Let's look what the temperatures were like from 1900 to 1910. Below average temperatures. We had a milder climate here. We had a variable climate, 50s, but let's look at what happened from the 1970s to the current period of time. Temperatures are increasing, the environment's changing, anthropogenic climate change. So we know the temperatures are changing. We could grow the best apples in the world because we had a great climate that supported that, and the climate has really significantly changed. But it's not just temperature, water makes a big difference. So here's a very similar graph. The dotted line across the middle is the average annual rainfall annualized over 140 years. And the purple jagged lines are the average annual rainfall that we see for that. So this is a drought index. Anything that is above the line means that actually it was a pretty moist period of time. Anything below the line shows that we're in a drier period of time. So in the 1900s, 1890s, 1900s, we had plenty of moisture. We had significantly more moisture than we do now. When my apple orchard was planted, we also saw that. We were averaging about 40 inches of rain a year. We're now averaging about 32 to 34 inches of rain a year. And you can see in the last 20, 25 years, we're below average on precipitation again. So the environment had a big impact on that. And we didn't have the technology of irrigation that we have now. There were other kinds of things that happened. There were changes in regulations and laws. The Pure Food Law of 1906 said you have to limit the amount of sulfur you used as a preservative on dried apples. It passed a law that you could have no rotted apples in a lot. If you had one rotted apple or fungus-laden apple in a barrel or a box, that ruined the entire load. So all of a sudden, you couldn't have apple peel in it either. And so a lot of Arkansas farmers thought this was an affront to close down our dried apple business. And in fact, it had that effect. So it did provide a safer food source for consumers, but it really negatively impacted us. Prohibition. Prior to Prohibition, we drank more apple cider than any other fermented beverage. And all of a sudden, we pass a law that says that's illegal. Now, it wasn't illegal for an orchardist or a homeowner to make cider for self-consumption. And self-consumption would mean also for your friends. It was illegal to sell it. But all of a sudden, we had a constitutional amendment that made the major use of apples in the United States illegal and really had a tremendous effect on us. But it's not all as bad. Things change. Things get better. We had a resurgence in the 1950s, 1960s. There were new opportunities. We had storage facilities and processing facilities being built in northwest Arkansas, new storage technology. When Zero Mountain was opened up, we had a resurgence of apple storage because they had very low cost storage of apples because the cooling of Zero Mountain, hence its name, was perfect for storing apples in that kind of area. Our shipping started to regrow. Northwest Arkansas became a tourist attraction, and I think even more than it is now. If I think back in my early childhood, we had a lot of tourism and tourist attractions in Northwest Arkansas. Our industry shifted. We still grew fruit primarily for processing. And we grew it for baby food with Gerber Baby Food located down in Fort Smith, the largest baby food plant, the largest baby food applesauce producer in the world, until they decided it was cheaper to buy apples from Chile than to buy apples from Arkansas. And that was a reality that shut that down. Schools bought apples, hospitals bought apples. The Rom family orchard, for a while, we sold apples to the Fayetteville Public Schools, the university, and Washington Regional Medical Center. And just almost in sequence, and to Dillon's grocery stores. And then almost in sequence, they said, we don't want to buy from you because your varieties change. This week, you're bringing in Jonathan. Next week, you're bringing in Golden Delicious. The week after that, you're bringing in John of Gold. And then you're bringing in Mutsu. We want to make one order at the beginning of the year, and you just deliver 6 bushels of apples every week of the year, and we want them all to be the same variety for consistency. And that kills small business because we grew 18 varieties of apples. Washington State, 70% of their apples were Red Delicious, and they could deliver apples 6 bushels a week looking exactly the same. They could do that 52 weeks of the year. We could only do it about 8 or 9 weeks of the year. And so we weren't a consistent supply for that. Pick Your Own became very popular until insurance caught up with us on that. And all of a sudden we became a litigious society. And it even impacted our family orchard when we had a complaint filed against us, an insurance complaint that somebody got stung by a bee. They were allergic to bees. There are bees in orchards. In fact, bees are fantastic places for orchards. In fact, we keep bees in orchards. So you can kind of expect to be stung by a bee, but our insurance agent didn't like that, and our insurance policy ended up becoming one of our most expensive production costs. And so we had to close down Pick Your Own. It still is. So by the 1980s, we went to fewer than 500 farms, fewer than 4,000 acres. Right now, it's fewer than 200 farms and probably fewer than 1,000 acres. There were no new farmers. There's the graying of agriculture in the United States, no farm credit, pesticide laws and regulations affected our production system. Pesticides we needed to control things were no longer allowed. We lost our storage facilities, retail merchandising. The largest retailer in the world that sells more groceries than any other grocery store in the world is Walmart. And they wanted consistent supplies. And so they want to buy from somebody that can deliver 1 million bushels of apples, not 1,000 bushels of apples. And so all of those things kind of change in time. But I still believe there's great local opportunity. We know that we have a fantastic local food system in Arkansas. We have several really good fruit farms in northwest Arkansas. In Fayetteville, we have Riverside Magara Farms. We have Ames Orchard out in Goshen. We have Gay Farms in Springdale, Van Zant Farms in Springdale, and Bethel Heights. We have A&A Orchards that's out of Berryville, but they sell at the co-op. They sell at all of our farmers markets. So we still produce great fruit. This is one of the first years of the Fayetteville Farmers Market. For those of you that go to the farmers market, and I assume that we all do, that's what we look like. And about half of the original sellers at our farmers market were apple farmers trying to find a new market opportunity. We still have environmental challenges, frost susceptibility. Our frosts in my time as being a professor at the university have moved our last frost from April 15th to April 5th. But our variability now, we will have our last frost of the spring anytime from about February 20th to May 1st. You might remember the year that we had snow on May 3rd, one of our first Friday events on the square here. So final exam day, and it's snowing in Fayetteville in May. So we're now seeing this variability of frosts. And variability is not something that orchards deal well with. Our high humidity and increasing humidity that we have, humidity is going up, causes russet on the fruit, makes them unmarketable for that. Our high night temperatures and climate change, it doesn't change the daytime temperatures much, it changes the nighttime temperatures significantly. Nighttime temperature is important in the color development of apples, and so we have a harder time coloring them. And we have significant pest pressure here. With a longer growing season than we now have, we have more generations of insects and disease than we used to have. What are the leading cultivars out in the world today? This is pretty up-to-date data. So the most important cultivar in the United States is Gala, followed by Red Delicious, but Red Delicious is rapidly declining. Honeycrisp in 2025, I think, will surpass that. Fuji, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, John Gold, and Pink Lady. There's a bunch of new apple cultivars that you might like. Sugar Bee, Cosmic Crisp that I was involved in when I was a professor out of Washington State. Bruce Barrett is the breeder for that. Brayburn, Jazz, Juicy, Sonia, Carew. We have more choices of apples now at the market than we've ever had before. So as I kind of wrap up, I want to share a little bit from Liberty Hyde Bailey. Liberty Hyde Bailey was the first professor of horticulture in the United States. At Cornell University, founded the first department of horticulture, and he was a pomologist. He was an apple aficionado. He wrote almost 100 books and lived into his late 90s. And he said this: how to eat an apple. Hold it. Note its size and its shape. See the blush on its shoulder. Inhale its fragrance. Hold it to your cheek. then bite it. Feel the break in cool, crisp flesh. Know the flow of the sprightly juice and the aroma that lies in its core. Only then have you eaten an apple. Thank you, Professor Bailey. So, that's my story of apples in the Ozarks, and I think we've kind of gotten to the end of it, and that's the core of the subject. So, I'd be glad to address any questions or take any stories that you might like to share. Yes?
What's your favorite apple?
What's my favorite apple? My favorite apple is the apple I ate today. And it very likely will be different tomorrow. So it is Gala season. And Galas I really enjoy. So Gala is an apple that came to us from New Zealand. And it is very crisp, has a wonderful flavor. But I'm going to tell this, and don't let anybody in New Zealand hear it. I ought to cover this up. Galas lose their flavor real quick. And so you'll notice in September that you pick galas starting the last week of August in Washington State, the largest producer, and they finish picking in September. I won't eat galas after November 1st because I find them to be flavorless. The crispness will be there, but you will have lost the flavor. I love Honeycrisp. Growers love selling Honeycrisp. They hate growing it. A seedling of Honeycrisp is Sugar Bee, and it's a wonderful apple. I also tend to like really tart apples. So I went out to Van Zant's a couple weeks ago, and I bought some Jonathan apples, which have always one of my favorites. I'm of German background, so I like tart things. I like that deep, real old flavor. So I bought some Jonathan apples. I bought some Golden Delicious apples, which I still think is a ripe Golden Delicious might be, in my mind, the perfect apple. They do get soft quickly, and that's their downfall for that. But they just have such a beautiful flavor. Golden Delicious was found on the hillside of another apple orchard in West Virginia. And Mr. Stark used to go around the United States, the Stark Brothers Nursery, go around the United States, and he'd go to state fairs, and he'd have an apple contest. And he'd give a prize, a monetary prize, to the first apple. But to accept the prize, you had to sell the apple to him, the apple tree. So he went around. That's how he found the Red Delicious apple. It was found at the state fair in Iowa. Its name was originally called the Hawkeye. And he bought it, and he named it the Star King Delicious. And then a red natural existing sport of it became the Star Crimson Delicious apple. He said it was the first apple he tasted that was delicious. And he thought it was a fantastic marketing, that the first apple that he would sell as an out-of-hand eating apple, the Delicious. So he went to West Virginia at the State Fair, and he found an apple that was growing on the side of an apple orchard. It was all yellow, and he loved it so much that he bought it. And he said he knew it was really good because it raised a perfect apple on a hillside where you couldn't raise hell with a half-gallon of whiskey. So he bought the tree and guarded that tree, and he named it Yellow Delicious. So you had the Red Delicious apple and the Yellow Delicious apple. And those became kind of the cornerstone of the edible apples in the United States. And apple consumption increased dramatically after Prohibition with those two fresh apples. So I love that apple. I'm not sure what apple I'll eat tomorrow. I have some Jonagolds. I really like them too. So my favorite apple is the apple I'm eating on that day, to answer your question. Yes, sir.
Can you raise an apple nowadays without any pesticide?
Can you raise an apple?
Marketable that you can sell at a farmer's market.
The question is, and let's classify what you mean by pesticide. Do you mean without synthetic pesticide, without chemical pesticides? Because I actually spent 20 years studying organic production, and I know that we can grow apples organically, and we have people that are doing that, that grow apples organically or primarily organically, and it can be done. It is much more expensive, and you're not using synthetic pesticides. The organic pesticides tend to have very, very short biological life. They might only be active for 48, 72, 96 hours before they break down in nature. So you end up applying them a number of times. So in my own organic research, in my conventional orchard, I could raise really high quality apples with about 8 sprays a year. In the organic orchard, it was close to 20 to 24 sprays a year. So I know I can do it without synthetic pesticide. I think it's very difficult with our current genetic technology to grow them in the absence of some form of insect or disease control. However, there are apple breeders around the world. They've solved fire blight. We know we can do that. They know they've solved apple scab. We know that they're breeding for insect resistances. And so it's a matter of breeding those. And the pace of development is increasing dramatically with our new genetic technology, our genomics, the ability to use CRISPR. And it really will be the question, will we as a consumer be willing to eat a genetically modified apple as opposed to an apple that we know was sprayed? And there's no evidence that genetic modified organisms are harmful to us. So,
we talked about little lime sulfur, and they said it would just run yellow patch, just the odor from that spray.
well, I used a lot of lime sulfur, and we in organic orchards use a lot of lime sulfur, and you can tell you're close to the orchard because you can smell the sulfur. It smells like rotten eggs. It's not the smell that drives them away, it's actually the sulfur compounds themselves in the lime acts as a protective film.
They talked about the lead arsenic. That one neighbor lady said that her family grew a lot of watermelons, and they would put it in a cloth sack, and she just walked over every one of those hills and just poop like it. She said her legs, of course, she wore grass back close to it, her legs would be just white with that dust.
Yep. That's how we controlled it. And it turned out to be, not everything we do in agriculture in hindsight was a good practice. But we've kind of moved on. We're developing new technologies. It's my hope as a fruit scientist, the students that I'm teaching will develop a way for us to grow these produce that would be environmentally tolerant, tolerate our current environment, be environmentally resilient, and have the resistance to the pests so we could grow them and provide a healthy local food crop without any of those kind of considerations. And economically, yeah, economically.
So how long does this lead arsenic stay in the soil? I mean, it's probably still there.
Well, I think if you pick up a soil science textbook, it moves, it leaches through the soil between 1 and 2 inches a year. So over 100 years, it's that deep. So I had a graduate student study. We could actually map out in an orchard where fruit trees were by the pattern of lead and arsenate that was still in the soil. I could show where the tree center was and where all the leaves fell down at the end of the season. It concentrates a ring of lead and arsenate around them. So we did a survey of that to see what the long-term environmental impact was. But it's there. It's there. Okay, well, thank you all very much. You were really good. I'm going to give you a gold star and an A, and I'm counting your attendances here. So thank you so much for participating today.